This is the Very Not Normal podcast with me, your host, Frieda Vizel. I like to finish my walking tours of Williamsburg at a kosher deli, a small kosher deli on the border between the hipster north side of Brooklyn's Williamsburg neighborhood and the Hasidic south side. I like to sit around the table and we try different kosher Hasidic food, farfel and kugel, and as we taste a bit of this and that, we talk, we discuss what we had seen, and I like to get a sense of how people process the visit to the Hasidic neighborhood. So I ask the following question. If you had been raised in this community, do you think you would have left? When I ask this question, maybe 3/4, maybe more hands go up. Some people will say, how can I know? And they wouldn't want to play. And some people will say, I don't think so. And I think that probably reflects what is the most likely thing to happen, because the Hasidic community actually has a very high retention rate. The number of people who leave, the percentage is in the single digits, probably the lower numbers of the single digits. So statistically, only a very small number of people in my group would have left, but they self-report that they would have left. So we have some 80% or 90% think that if they were raised in a fundamentalist group, they would have left, but in reality, some, maybe 5%, even less, leave. Why the disparity between what people from the secular world say they would have done and what the actual reality in the Hasidic community is? The answer to this has a lot to do with conformity and human nature, and I really want to talk about these things because I think they're very important, so stick with me. When my customers raise their hand and they say, I would have been out, I say, why? What makes you say that? And they would say a variation of, I like freedom, I like traveling, I enjoy doing things, I'm a feminist, I like equal rights, I like education, I wouldn't like having so many kids. They all say a variation of, I am an individualist, I know what's in my best interest in this vacuum, and I would have gone after my best interest regardless of what the rest of the community does. They imagine themselves as isolated pods of individual humans who act entirely outside any social construct, and therefore, if they don't like the Hasidic community, all they have to do is up and leave. And the way in which the leaving story is told also adds to it, because the story is often, I lost faith. First I believed and then I lost faith. It's all an individual cognitive process. As long as I was duped, I went along. As long as I believed it was the right thing, I went along. And then I lost faith, I stopped believing, and I left. It's so interesting that in this way of thinking, there is no recognition of anything resembling family, resembling relationships. It's simply our lives are designed by our cognitive functions. And if our cognitive functions are optimal, if we see the light, if we know the truth, then we take action accordingly. The concept of brainwashing, the whole idea of brainwashing, is so on par with this. It's this mystical concept where people's brains are hijacked and they are frozen under the evil spell of some powerful, malicious force. For this episode, I did an image search on the web for the word brainwashing, and the results are very telling. All of them are pictures of people sitting on a chair with either a big tinfoil hat and wires curling out of the hat, coming in and out of the brain, emitting data, changing, reprogramming, or it's maybe a television, a radio, or other media emitting hypnotic swirls to the eyes of the entranced viewer who is now being brainwashed. What's interesting about these images is they're all machines. They sound a lot like you're inputting data, you're extracting data, you're messing with the information inside a mechanical thing. But actually, the process of brainwashing, if we'll use the term, the process of conditioning someone else to agree with you is distinctly social. It is an extremely interpersonal mechanism. It is one that should be depicted with people. It should be about interactions. It should be visualized as a relationship. But instead, we imagine brainwashing to be this fantastic, strange, utterly otherworldly concept. I always prefer to brainwashing words like even indoctrination, or maybe value imbuing, or social conditioning, I think is very appropriate. But one thing is for sure, that our current language imagines that people's actions arise out of whatever is programmed in their brain in isolation of themselves, and that they exist barely within a network of others, and that their actions come all out of an internal mechanism. So when I ask on my tour of people, do you think you would have left? They answer me a variation of, I think I'm completely self-made and I am stronger and more individualistic than the power of the social. This is utterly not how humans work. I don't understand how it's come to this place in the world where people imagine themselves to operate outside of social constructs. It strikes me as weird. It is so obvious that we are, as a species, extremely interconnected. We depend on each other to an incredible degree. Just look around your house, your food, your clothing. All of it depends on millions of people, millions of ideas. We can't do anything on our own. We are a species of cooperation. More than anything, our success as humans is in producing shelter and producing our food and sustenance, all of it by working together, by splitting specializations. We have a very deep need as a part of that to belong inside the group, to be respected in the group, to be looked up, to be valued. It's the strangest thing of individualism, and it's the strangest thing of our modern techno-utopia, where a part of it is this cowboy, rugged, or yar, pull myself up by the bootstraps, and the other part of it is this, I am an optimal machine for my own self-interest and mine alone, that together make people think that what they would do would be in their own best interest, and they would have no concern about what their neighbors would say, what their family would say. They would simply leave. It would just be, I don't like this, so I leave. There's a complete disconnect from how much social organization controls us. There's a video that you have to watch. I'll link it. It's 2 minutes long, and it's an experiment at a university. A number of students who were finalists for something were brought into a room one by one to fill out paperwork. Now, here's what they did. They had 3 students sit in the room. It was a big empty room, a circle of chairs, and these 3 students were planted by the experiment to stand up and sit down at intervals of the ring of a bell. It would go ding, and the 3 planted students stood up and kept filling out the paperwork. Ding, and they sat down and kept filling out the paperwork. So the researchers brought in one by one the subjects to sit in this circle of chairs and to fill out their own paperwork, and lo and behold, the subjects looked around. It seemed very weird, but when they saw that everyone stood up at the ring of the bell, they also stood up. There were some outliers, and the researchers pulled the outliers out of the room. So if you just kept writing and you didn't go along with the standing up and sitting down, you were called out. Eventually, the researchers removed the students who had been planted, and they kept ringing the bell, and without anyone having been told, and without anyone having any cues and having any instructions or any reason to do it, they kept standing up and sitting down at the ring of a bell. Does that surprise you? It sure as hell does not surprise me. It is absolutely entirely reasonable. These people might say that they stood up and sat down because they had some rationalization for it. I don't know what they would tell themselves, but the bottom line is that they stood up and sat down because they're human, And humans want social approval. We want to fit in. We don't want to stand out. We want to be accepted by our peers, and almost everything we do is oriented towards our place in the social setting. Conformity is in our bones. When we rationalize and we say, I do it because of this and because of that, when in reality we do it because everyone was doing it. As we say in Yiddish, jede geht, everyone goes, jede tit, everyone does, jede zucht, everyone says. If everyone does it, we do it. That's really the reason. But we rationalize away, then we lose track of the fact of how completely we are a product of our society and how little we actually are independent individual people. So the correct answer actually for would you have left, I think, depends on 3 important social variables. A, your nature, your personality, how conformist you are. B, how much you stand to lose personally by conforming or not conforming. And C, how tolerant the society itself is. So I'm going to go into each of these in turn. As for A, personality, I think human nature is very, very big part of this. What type of person you are. I think the vast majority of people are rule followers, and then there are the people who are rule enforcers, and then there are the people who are rule questioners, and people who are rule breakers. It's just a very rough generalization of temperament of conformity. There are people who will be contrarians. If you say the rule is A, they will do intentionally the other. There are people who will respect the rule so long as the rule makes sense to them. There are people who, if it is the rule, then that is everything. And there are people who, if it is the rule, it is an opportunity for them to use it to abuse other people who don't follow the rule. Paul Graham, an entrepreneur and blogger, has an interesting system for doing essentially a breakdown of these personality types based on conformism. And he calls it 4 quadrants of conformism. And he'll say you go to any kindergarten class, you can see these types, these kids who, for instance, the aggressively conventional-minded ones, the tattletales, who, whenever someone doesn't follow the rule, runs to the teacher and gleefully tells the teacher. There are the passively conventional-minded, the sheep, the ones who go along, who want to be good, and who get very scared if someone is making trouble that kid is going to get in trouble. There are the absent-minded, not even aware of the rules in the 3rd quadrant. I'm not even sure about that quadrant. And then he has the upper right quadrant, the aggressively independent-minded, the naughty ones. When they see a rule, their first impulse is to question it. Merely being told what to do makes them inclined to do the opposite. I think these categories are... I'm not a big fan of putting things into boxes and categories. I think they're always limiting. But I think it does give us a sense of when we talk about different types of people who have different relationships to authority. For instance, there are a vast majority of people will be very deferential to the norms. If the norms will be something that everyone dips their head into a puddle of mud on their way to the subway, if this is the norm, then they cannot imagine anything else, and they get very upset if you try to suggest that this is weird. There are people for whom the norms create the boundaries of thought, and to go outside of those boundaries of thought is very unacceptable to them. Even if they're very, very bright, they will stay inside the boundaries of thought. There are also people who are power hungry and understand the opportunities within the boundary of thought to impose on others. You know, the abusive, the narcissistic types take advantage of conformism because conformism is a clear-cut set of rules. There's a good and a bad, and there you can say, here's someone who's bad, and maybe build yourself up on that. So all of these personalities play a role in how likely you are to stand up to a conformist society. But interestingly, many of the nonconformists, for instance, from the Hasidic community, are in the community and don't leave, even if maybe they don't really fit into the community, because this alone, temperament alone, is not enough. The second condition is what you stand to lose or gain by not conforming. If, for instance, you're very well embedded in a system and you're respected and you're moneyed, then you are much less likely to break away than if you're maybe already not doing well. So let's say in the lockdown scenario, epidemiologists have an incentive to want to go along with a narrative because it benefits them. If they go against the narrative, they can have difficulties getting grants, they can have difficulties getting positions, their reputations can be smeared. So the deeper you are embedded in the system, the more likely you are to just willfully convince yourself that the system works correctly. In the Hasidic community, we see a great number of people who leave come from so-called broken homes. And we see this in general in the ultra-Orthodox community, and the community will often say, see, people leave not because our system is broken, but because these particular people fell out of the system and unfortunately were abused, or their parents got divorced, or whatever thing happened that was different about them. But our system itself works. It just, they themselves were sort of the product in the machine that somehow came out wrong. This deflection is completely dishonest. The people who leave often have very serious and very legitimate qualms with the system, and they leave because, or they might leave because, the system has wronged them. But if they come from a home where their status is embedded as a higher order, where they by default have more to gain by staying than by leaving, then of course they're more likely to put up with whatever consequences they might suffer from the system. If you're in the community and you, let's say, have a very successful business, you have all your clientels are Hasidic, you have 8 children who are doing fairly well, why would you leave? It would be a very different story than someone who is twice divorced and comes from a home that is maybe of Yemenite origin and is therefore on a lower rung. It's not that the system is not broken. It's that those who get enough sustenance from the system are much less likely to unplug themselves, to borrow from the matrix, than those who are not getting enough sustenance from the system. So the answer to the question of would you have left, it depends if you would have had a good marriage, it depends if you would have had a good career, it depends if you would have had money. All of these factors are very important in pushing you to or fro conformity. Conformity is a bias that increases the more embedded into a system you are and more dependent you are on the system. Now let me talk about the third and most important part of this, which is the system itself. Societies that are more or less conformist, and this is something that made my trek to a less conformist society only to be here, so I'm going to go into it a little bit. It won't be boring. Be right back. So it matters a lot. The environment in which we're in makes a great difference on our own experience. I think it speaks to people's relative freedom that they are so disconnected from their actual relationship with the social fabric in which they are in. And that is to say, most people who tell me that they are autonomous individuals don't understand that they are in a society that's less conformist and lets them be more unique, and this makes them think that they are completely self-driven and that they are above the pressures and the stresses and the powers and manipulations of a repressive society. But a repressive society is a lot like a toxic relationship, and I'm not comparing the Hasidic community to a relationship per se. It's a lot more complicated, but to the point here, people who have not been in abusive relationships, people who didn't live in very dysfunctional dynamics, often have a very hard time understanding why anyone would give in to the manipulations of a unhealthy relationship. Many people who are survivors of difficult relationships say, I never thought this could be me. Because we think, in theory, oh, I would never allow myself to, but our emotional connectedness, our empathy, our desire to connect and satisfy and to placate and cooperate all end up opening us up to a much more complicated and potential psychological torment if the relationship is unhealthy. And like an unhealthy relationship between two people, there could be an unhealthy relationship on the sociological scale. And that would be when everything is very repressive and the same. When everything is the same, then anyone who does differently starts to stand out. So if you deviate from what everyone does because it doesn't make sense to you, because you're funky, or because you just want to do your own thing, then you are punished. So if one person deviates from what everyone does, let's say everyone wears black all the time, and one person buys a pink thing, this one person will stand out. If half the people were wearing colors, then one additional person putting on colors would suffer no social consequences. But if this one person stands out, becomes an isolated target, then they suffer social punishment almost by default, because the natural tendency towards cooperation will mean that everyone looks at you and says, you're not normal, you're different, you're outside of us, we need to persecute you for it. And there are always bullies who step up to the plate and who will proclaim self-righteously that the person who's different needs to be ostracized on moral grounds. There's a lot of moralizing. So the person who stands out becomes a target and can get really hurt socially, which then sends a message to everyone else to be extra careful to wear really black, not even gray. So what I'm saying is that for a community to become conformist, for the tipping point to reach where people's behavior start to be amended into intense conformity, there needs to be a critical threshold. A large majority of the population needs to start to do the same thing, and then anyone who deviates becomes a target. And I think until recently, this critical threshold just wasn't met in the Western public. There was just enough diversity that people didn't really understand what it is like when everyone agrees and you're an outlier, and how intense the emotional pressure gets. And that when you see someone has been canceled for saying something, for phrasing themselves in a way that was too callous, you start to double check and triple check and watch what you say and watch what you think and modify your own self. The effect of this is one of a lot of psychic harm, because you go from just living, listening to your mind, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to go, this is where I want to wear, to always narrating yourself in the eyes of others. What will others say? Will they laugh? Will they punish me? Will I be ostracized? So there is a constant stress and fear of punishment and a self-restraint, which can get tighter and tighter as the conformity gets more repressive. We can see with, for instance, the lockdowns and the masks, that what happens when everyone is called a killer and a terrible person if they don't go along with it, that people start to be hypocrites, that no one dares to say anything out loud, even if they think quietly, that maybe they have a different opinion, that there's a lot of paranoia. You watch what you say, you don't say what you think, you try to look away, you start to self-censor what you expose yourself to, so you don't end up having ideas that will shatter your place in the social fabric. This is our survival instinct that employs a whole toolkit of self-preservation mechanisms that allows us to use our cognitive abilities to the maximum to self-deceive and to do everything possible to ultimately remain in the in-group with the good guys. So we are capable of cognitive dissonance, which is when we believe one thing and another thing at the same time, and we allow both to exist in our minds, even though it's a contradiction. Orwell calls it doublethink. We rationalize, we tell ourselves lies, we have selective attention, we look away from that which will shatter the illusion. We employ every kind of logical fallacy and argumentative trick to maybe smear the people that have the ideas that are in the out group so that you can give yourself permission to remain in the in group. We use our brilliance not to come to the most correct, truest, best conclusion, but rather we use our brilliance to come to whatever we can to hold on to a semblance of self-respect and to our families and our economic viability and so on. And if you are lucky to be in a society where you don't have to make these concessions, you can just be yourself and still hold on to all these things, then you won't understand it. But when you live it, it touches you. It really, really touches you. This quote from the Soviet dissident Vasily Grossman is very apt. In one of his fiction works in which he captured what it's like to live under the repressive Soviet regime, he wrote, "An invisible force was crushing him. He could feel its weight, its hypnotic power. It was forcing him to think as it wanted, to write as it dictated. This force was inside him. It could dissolve his will and cause his heart to stop beating. Only people who have never felt such a force themselves can be surprised that others submit to it. Those who have felt it, on the other hand, feel astonished that a man can rebel against it for even a moment with one sudden word of anger, one timid gesture of protest." I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Very Not Normal podcast with me, Frieda Vizel. If you liked it, please consider spreading the word, liking, subscribing, sharing. You can also leave me feedback by going to my anchor.fm page. There's a link in the episode description of how to get to it. I'm also including in the episode description links to other sources I'm mentioning in the podcast so you can do your further deep dives. If you would like to, you can also check out my other work at friedavizel.com. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.